The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the backyard as I floated lazily on my back in the pool, my body suspended in the cool, clear water. The quiet hum of summer surrounded me, the distant chirp of cicadas, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax completely, the tension of the past few days melting away. I didn't hear her approach at first, too lost in the rhythmic lapping of the water against my skin. It wasn't until I caught the faint shadow out of the corner of my eye that I realized I wasn't alone. I turned my head, my body still half floating in the pool, to see her standing at the edge of the water, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching me. "Enjoying yourself, my stepmom?" Claire asked, her voice soft and teasing. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yeah," I replied, treading water now as I stood in the shallow end of the pool. "Just trying to cool off." Claire smiled, though there was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. She'd always been beautiful, elegant in that effortless way that some people are, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, her skin tanned from days spent outdoors. Today, she wore a simple sundress, the fabric clinging to her curves in a way that made it difficult not to notice. "I thought I'd come out and join you," she said, her eyes flicking to the pool before returning to me. "It's too hot to stay inside." I nodded, though my heart had started to beat a little faster in my chest. There had always been something about Claire, something that made it impossible for me to be completely at ease around her. She was kind, always smiling, always making me feel welcome after my dad had married her, but there was an undeniable tension between us, something I couldn't explain, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. She slipped off her sandals and stepped closer to the edge of the pool, dipping one toe into the water to test the temperature. Her sundress swayed gently in the breeze, and I found myself watching her more intently than I should have, my gaze lingering on the way the fabric brushed against her thighs, the way her hair caught the light as she bent down to sit on the edge of the pool. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, glancing over at me, her voice light and casual, though there was something else in her tone that sent a shiver down my spine. "Not at all," I replied, though the words felt thick in my throat. I turned away, trying to focus on anything other than the way her legs dangled in the water, the way her skin gleamed in the afternoon light. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence. I swam lazy laps back and forth, feeling the water move around me, trying to distract myself from the way Claire's presence seemed to fill the space between us. But it was impossible to ignore the soft sound of her laughter as she dipped her hands into the pool, the way her gaze seemed to follow me as I swam, always just a little too close, always just a little too intense. I wasn't sure when it started, this strange pull between us. It had been subtle at first, a lingering glance here, a brush of fingers there, but over time, it had grown stronger, more insistent, until I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something unspoken between us, something dangerous, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to look away. "Why don't you come closer?" Claire said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I turned to find her smiling at me, her eyes glinting with a teasing light. "You look like you're a million miles away." I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something in the way she said it, something in her smile that made my pulse quicken. But before I could think better of it, I swam closer, stopping just a few feet from where she sat on the edge of the pool. "That's better," she said softly, her gaze never leaving mine. "It's nicer when you're not so far away." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. There was no mistaking the shift between us now. The playful teasing had given way to something else, something far more dangerous. I could feel the tension humming in the air, thick and palpable, as if we were both waiting for something to happen, something that we couldn't come back from. Claire slid off the edge of the pool, her legs slipping into the water as she moved closer to me. The sudden movement startled me, but I didn't back away. Instead, I stood frozen, my eyes locked on hers as she waded through the shallow water, her sundress billowing out around her. "You seem tense," she said softly, her voice low and soothing. "Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I was feeling? The confusion, the desire, the guilt that twisted inside me like a knot, pulling tighter with every passing second. She was my stepmom. This was wrong. But the way she was looking at me, the way her body moved so effortlessly through the water, made it impossible to think straight. I'm fine, I managed to say, though my voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. She stopped just in front of me, her body so close I could feel the warmth radiating off her skin. Her eyes searched mine, as if she could see right through me, as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. You don't seem fine, she said softly, her hand reaching out to brush against my arm, her touch light but electric, sending a jolt of heat coursing through me. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing in my ears. I should have stepped back. I should have said something to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen in place, as her hand slid down my arm, her fingers trailing lightly over my skin. You can talk to me, you know, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper now. I'm here for you. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to let her pull me into whatever this was between us. But I couldn't. There was too much at stake. My dad, my family, everything I'd worked so hard to keep together, it would all come crashing down if I gave in to this. But Claire didn't seem to care about any of that. Her gaze never wavered, her touch never faltered, as if she were waiting for me to make the next move, waiting for me to decide whether we crossed that line or not. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was trying to hold back. You don't have to say anything, she murmured, her hand moving to cup the side of my face, her thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. Just let me in. My breath hitched in my throat as her words sank in. Let me in. It was such a simple request, and yet it felt like she was asking for so much more than just my words. She was asking for everything, for me to trust her, to let down my guard, to give in to the desire that had been building between us for so long. And in that moment, I couldn't resist. I closed the small distance between us, my hands reaching out to rest on her hips, pulling her closer. Claire's breath caught as our bodies pressed together, the warmth of her skin searing against mine, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just the overwhelming need to feel her, to be with her, in a way that I knew was wrong but couldn't deny any longer. Claire's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick succession as our bodies stayed close, the water lapping softly around us. The silence between us felt thick, heavy, charged with something that neither of us wanted to put into words. We had always been careful before, careful not to let the looks linger too long, careful not to let the touches feel too intentional. But now, here in the pool with no one around, it felt like the careful lines we'd drawn had blurred beyond recognition. I could feel her heart racing just as fast as mine as I let my hands linger on her hips. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand moved from my cheek to the back of my neck, her fingers tangling lightly in my damp hair. The soft pressure of her touch made my pulse quicken, my breath catching in my throat. This feels... Claire started, her voice barely above a whisper, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both knew what she was trying to say. Her fingers tightened slightly in my hair, her eyes searching mine for some kind of answer, some kind of reassurance that I wanted this just as much as she did. And I did. God, I did. But the weight of what we were about to do, the consequences that would follow, hung over us like a storm cloud. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away before we crossed a line we could never uncross. But I didn't move. Instead, I leaned in, closing the distance between us, my lips barely brushing against hers in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was a whisper of a touch, a question more than a statement, as if we were both asking ourselves if this was really happening, if this was what we wanted. Claire responded immediately, her lips pressing more firmly against mine, her hand sliding down to rest against my chest. The kiss deepened slowly, a soft exploration, hesitant at first, as if we were both testing the waters. But the tension that had been building between us for months, years, even, finally broke, and the kiss became something more urgent, something more desperate. I pulled her closer, my hands moving to her waist, gripping her tightly as our bodies pressed together. The water lapped against us, a quiet reminder of the world outside, but it felt distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the way Claire's lips moved against mine, the soft moan that escaped her as my hands slid up her back. Her sundress clung to her skin, the thin fabric now soaked through from the water, and I could feel the heat of her body through the damp material. My fingers found the edge of the dress, and before I knew what I was doing, I was tugging it upward, the wet fabric slipping easily over her head and floating away in the pool. She stood before me now in just her bikini, her skin glistening in the fading sunlight, and for a moment, I just stared at her, taking in every curve, every line of her body. Claire didn't look away. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, and I could see the same desire, the same hunger reflected back at me. Without a word, I reached out, pulling her back to me, our lips colliding in another heated kiss. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was fierce, filled with all the unspoken tension that had been simmering between us for so long. My hands roamed her body, exploring every inch of her skin, and Claire's fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, as if she couldn't get enough. We stumbled backward, the edge of the pool catching me off guard, and I fell back into the shallow water, pulling Claire with me. She let out a surprised laugh, her body landing on top of mine, her legs straddling my hips. The sound of her laughter, so carefree, so full of life, sent a wave of warmth through me, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Just the two of us, tangled together in the water, laughing like there was no tomorrow. But then, as the laughter died down, the weight of what we were doing began to settle in once again. Claire's eyes darkened, the playfulness fading as her gaze locked onto mine. The tension between us returned, thicker than ever, and I could feel the pull of desire, the way her body pressed against mine, her fingers gripping my shoulders as if she didn't want to let go. "This is," Claire began, her voice shaky, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We shouldn't be doing this." "I know," I replied, my voice just as unsteady. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did she. I could see it in the way her body trembled, in the way her eyes lingered on mine, filled with a mixture of desire and guilt. We both knew this was wrong. But knowing something is wrong doesn't make it any easier to stop. She leaned down, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "I don't want to stop either." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could think better of it, I was kissing her again, my hands sliding up her back, pulling her closer. The feel of her skin, the taste of her lips, the way she responded to every touch, it was intoxicating, overwhelming, and I was drowning in it. Claire's hands moved down my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my muscles, her touch light but deliberate. I groaned softly, the sound slipping out before I could stop it, and Claire's lips curled into a small smile against mine. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she was enjoying every second of it. "Do you want this?" she asked softly, her voice low, seductive. "Yes," I breathed, my hands gripping her hips as I pulled her closer, needing to feel every inch of her against me. She let out a soft sigh, her body arching into mine as she whispered, "Then take me." Her words were a command, a plea, and I couldn't resist. My hands moved to the knot at the back of her bikini, my fingers trembling as I worked to undo it. The fabric fell away, exposing her bare skin, and for a moment, I just stared, taking in the sight of her. Claire didn't move, didn't say a word. She just watched me, her eyes dark with desire, her lips slightly parted as she waited for me to make the next move. I reached out, my hands brushing lightly against her skin, and she shivered under my touch. Her breath hitched, her body trembling as I traced the curve of her waist, my fingers lingering at the edge of her bikini bottoms. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm sure." That was all I needed to hear. The rest of the world faded away as I pulled her down onto me, our bodies pressed together, skin to skin. The heat between us was unbearable, and every touch, every kiss felt like fire, igniting something deep inside me that I couldn't control. We moved together, slow at first, hesitant, as if we were still testing the boundaries of this new, forbidden territory. But as the minutes passed, the hesitation faded, replaced by an urgency that neither of us could deny. Our movements became more frantic, more desperate, as if we were both trying to chase something we knew we couldn't have. Claire's fingers dug into my skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she arched against me, her body trembling with the intensity of it all. I could feel her heartbeat, fast and unsteady, matching the rhythm of my own, and for a moment, it felt like we were completely in sync, like we were one. The tension between us built, higher and higher, until it finally snapped, sending us both tumbling over the edge. Claire cried out, her body shaking as she clung to me, and I followed soon after, the intensity of it all leaving me breathless, my mind spinning. For a long time, we lay there in the shallow water, our bodies tangled together, the sound of our ragged breathing the only thing breaking the silence. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, for the line we had crossed, the point of no return. Eventually, Claire pulled away, sitting up slowly, her eyes distant as she looked out at the water. The reality of what we had done was beginning to sink in, and I could see the guilt, the confusion, written all over her face. "We shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I replied, sitting up beside her, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. But even as I said the words, I knew that I didn't regret it. Not really. There was something between us, something undeniable, and no matter how wrong it was, I couldn't bring myself to wish it away. "What now?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how we were supposed to go back to the way things were after this. All I knew was that the connection between us, the pull we felt toward each other, wasn't something that could be easily ignored. "We figured out," I said finally, though my voice lacked confidence. Claire nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "We can't tell anyone," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "Of course not," I agreed, though the idea of keeping this a secret felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the water lapping gently against us, our minds both racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air between us had shifted irrevocably, and though neither of us wanted to admit it, we both knew there was no going back to the way things were. Claire stood up first, the water cascading off her body as she moved to the edge of the pool. I watched her in silence, the guilt gnawing at me with every step she took. She wrapped a towel around herself, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to distance herself from everything that had just transpired. "I'm going inside," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the quiet sounds of the pool. Her back was to me, and I could tell by the tension in her shoulders that she was struggling just as much as I was. I wanted to say something, anything, to make this right, to reassure her that we could figure it out, that everything would be okay. But the words wouldn't come. They felt hollow, empty, like promises I couldn't keep. Claire didn't wait for a response. She walked toward the house, her figure disappearing into the fading light of the evening, leaving me alone in the pool, the water suddenly feeling much colder than it had before. I stayed there for a long time, my thoughts swirling, my heart heavy with confusion and guilt. What had I done? What had we done? The weight of it all pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I knew I should have stopped it. I should have pulled away the moment things started to escalate, the moment it became clear that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But I hadn't. I had wanted her, wanted this for so long, and in that moment, all the reasons we shouldn't have just disappeared. But now, the consequences of our actions were settling in, and they were far more complicated than I had anticipated. Claire wasn't just some woman.
She was my stepmom.
My dad's wife. And what we had done, it was unforgivable. I climbed out of the pool, the cool air hitting my skin as I grabbed a towel and wrapped it around myself. The house loomed in the distance, dark and quiet, and for a moment, I considered staying outside, avoiding whatever conversation would inevitably follow if I went back in. But I couldn't. We needed to talk. We needed to figure out what this meant, where we went from here. As I walked back to the house, the weight of what had just happened hung heavy over me. The door clicked softly behind me as I stepped inside, the sound echoing in the quiet of the house. Everything felt too still, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Claire was in the kitchen, her back to me as she leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. I could see the tension in her body, the way her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed slightly, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "Claire," I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't turn around at first. For a moment, I wasn't even sure she'd heard me. But then, slowly, she straightened, her hands dropping to her sides as she took a deep breath. When she finally turned to face me, her expression was unreadable, her eyes guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to talk about what happened," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. Claire's gaze flicked to the floor, her arms crossing over her chest as if she were trying to shield herself from the weight of the conversation. "There's nothing to talk about," she said quietly, her voice tight. "It was a mistake. A lapse in judgment. That's all." Her words cut through me like a knife, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. A mistake. A lapse in judgment. Was that really all it had been? "Is that what you really think?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Claire's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker in them. Something like guilt, or maybe regret. But she quickly looked away, her jaw tightening as she forced herself to keep her composure. "It doesn't matter what I think," she said, her voice steady but cold. "It can't happen again." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. She was right, of course. We couldn't let this happen again. It was too dangerous, too complicated. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to accept. "I don't regret it," I admitted quietly, my eyes searching hers for some kind of response. Claire flinched, her expression softening for just a moment before she quickly hardened it again. "You should," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We both should." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and I struggled to find the right words, something that would make sense of this mess we had created. But there was nothing. No easy way out. No simple solution. The reality of what we had done was too heavy, too tangled in guilt and desire and the messy complexity of human emotions. "What do we do now?" asked, my voice trembling. Claire shook her head, her eyes distant as she stared at the floor. "We move on," she said softly. "We pretend it never happened. We forget about it." But I couldn't forget. I knew I wouldn't be able to forget. The way her skin had felt against mine, the way her breath had hitched as our bodies moved together, the way we had both let go of all the rules, all the barriers, if only for a moment, it was all seared into my memory. "Is that really what you want?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Claire looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. For a moment, I thought she might say something, admit that she felt the same way, that she didn't want to forget either. But then, she shook her head, her expression hardening once more. "It doesn't matter what I want," she said, her voice cold and distant. "What matters is that we do the right thing. And the right thing is to move on." I nodded, though the ache in my chest told me that it wasn't going to be that simple. I couldn't just move on. Not after everything we had shared, everything we had felt. But I knew that pushing her, trying to make her admit to something she wasn't ready to confront, would only make things worse. "Okay," I said quietly, though the word felt like a lie. Claire let out a shaky breath, her arms tightening around herself as she turned back to the sink, her back to me once again. The conversation was over. She had made her decision, and there was no changing it. I stood there for a long time, my heart heavy, my thoughts swirling, before I finally turned and walked away. The house felt too big, too empty as I made my way to my room, the weight of our encounter settling over me like a dark cloud. I lay on my bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, replaying every moment of what had happened between us. The way her lips had felt against mine, the way her body had trembled under my touch, the way we had both given in to something we knew was wrong but couldn't resist. It was all too fresh, too raw. And then there was the guilt. The crushing weight of knowing that I had crossed a line, that we had both crossed a line, that couldn't be uncrossed. How was I supposed to face my dad after this? How was I supposed to look at Claire and pretend like nothing had happened? I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that things would never be the same. The connection between Claire and me had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface, but now that it had been brought to the forefront, there was no way to bury it again. The days that followed were strained, the tension between Claire and me palpable in every glance, every conversation. We tried to pretend like everything was normal, like we were just a stepmom and stepson going about our daily lives. But the weight of what had happened, the pull of what we both still felt, lingered in the air between us, impossible to ignore. We never spoke of that night again. We never acknowledged the lines we had crossed, the desires we had given into. But the unresolved tension between us remained, a constant reminder of the forbidden connection we had shared and the guilt that came with it. And as time went on, I realized that some things can't be forgotten, no matter how hard you try.